Good evening. Can you please stand with me and join me? And at this time, I would like to say a prayer in my language and sing you a song. So you can, at this time, look to your higher power, to your understanding that you know of. Hotunkash wa kantanka tate do ponchimaka wambly gleshka oyateki. Lena oyateki ake wocheki alkaga lena hash ushake ushiki lai omake apotunkash wa kantaka. Dagnishi chesniolo lena oyateki lena social justice committee ki lena hash ushake ushiki lai omake apo we chosni na woke wola kota. Wo ableza, wo akwala, wo achitankana we chanchage, wanglake, wa uksape, wo ushikilayo, o makiapo, takasha wa kantaka. Ushauke, lena oyateki, lena hashtag nishichesniolo, takasha wa kantaka, o makiapo, o kiapo, lena oyateki. Just give you a brief description about what I said in my language and what I sang about. Was I said a prayer for the Social Justice Committee and the people that are here, that the Creator can bless and watch over each and every one of us in our minds, hearts, and bodies and souls, that we get the education, the wisdom, and knowledge that we need in our well-being, that the Creator can secure and bless each and every one of us and safe travels home when we leave here, and that we can leave here, each and every one of us, with blessings spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, and psychologically. The song that I sang was asking the Spirit, the great mystery, to come and watch over you, watch over us. You know, so that's what that song says repeatedly. Asking the Great Spirit, the spirits, to come and watch over us at this time. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence, for a wonderful performance, for the prayer, which we can all use, and for sharing one of your beautiful traditions with us. Thank you. I am Barbara Snyder, president of Case Western Reserve University, and I am delighted to welcome you to the 4th Biennial Intergenerational Think Tank, Educating for Struggle, State Violence Then and Now. I want to begin by saying a special thank you to Professor Tim Black, who is serving as interim director of the Social Justice Institute and ensuring that its important work continues. Tim, thank you for that. I also want to recognize, and I know she's here somewhere, Dr. Rhonda Williams in the back row, who has returned to to participate in Think Tank 2017. As always, Professor Williams, Dr. Rhonda, it is wonderful to have you with us. She is actually the person who asked me to come and do this welcome. So here I am, and here you are. Thank you. You have a really interesting, important program focusing on environmental justice, indigenous rights, immigration, and incarceration, among other topics, looking through the lens of the interrelationships of race and class and violence. And this evening, you are going to hear from an exceptional scholar who studies human rights and indigenous peoples, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and we are very lucky to have her on our campus leading this conversation today. During the last year, events around race, gender, sexual identity, immigration status, and gun violence, among others, remain at the forefront of social justice issues that we must continue to address. The research, scholarship, teaching, and community engagement of Case Western Reserve's Social Justice Institute remains ever important in helping us in our community make progress on these fronts. The Social Justice Institute grew out of our 2008 strategic plan, Forward Thinking, and began its important work in the fall of 2010. It builds on the university's long history of embracing social justice as a deeply held value. Last month, we had the wonderful experience of dedicating a new historic marker on our campus. One side of the marker features the legacy of one of our predecessor institutions, Western Reserve University, which was then located in Hudson, Ohio, and its role in the anti-slavery movement. In 1854, students at Western Reserve invited Frederick Douglass, former slave and outspoken proponent of abolitionism, to speak at Western Reserve during commencement week. In his speech, he urged the audience to be active in the work against slavery. The other side of the historic marker is an honor of the Ford family, whose home served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. The historic marker, which is on the site of the Allen Memorial Library at Case Western Reserve, so on Adelbert, just off Euclid, is actually on the site of the Ford family's land. And it is incredible to think that there was a stop on the Underground Railroad right here. You can see an image of the Ford family house on the other side. And if you haven't stopped by to see the marker, I hope you will do it. There are many other examples of the social justice roots of Case Western Reserve, and we are proud of that. But we know the work goes on. And we are proud of the work of the Social Justice Institute, begun with the leadership of Dr. Rhonda Williams and continuing with the work of Dr. Tim Black and its role in helping us advance social change. The Institute holds conversations like the ones you will have during this think tank, where we hope you will exchange ideas, learn from each other, and emerge with innovative solutions for many of the social justice issues that will be discussed today and tomorrow. I want to thank you all for taking your time to participate in this fourth biennial think tank. This work is so important, and your participation makes an enormous difference. I am especially grateful to the speakers who will be sharing their wisdom with us. I wish you a very successful think tank. I look forward to hearing the results of it, and I regret that I cannot stay and personally hear the conversation as it unfolds, but a few of my colleagues in here will be letting me know exactly how the conversation goes. So thank you again for participating. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dean Cyrus Taylor from the College of Arts and Sciences to extend his welcome. Thank you all.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to join President Snyder in welcoming you to Think Tank 2017. I'd like to thank the Social Justice Institute and its interim director, Tim Black, for organizing this important event. I also want to say how much I admire the many programs the Institute has created to advance social justice through research, education, and community engagement. During its first 7 years, the Institute has done an outstanding job in pursuing its core mission, cultivating awareness, critical inquiry, and activism in response to some of the most urgent problems facing our society. Beginning with last night's screening of the film Wounded Knee and this evening's keynote address by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, Think Tank 2017 is exploring the theme of state violence then and now. Through a series of lectures, panel discussions, and breakout sessions, the think tank will examine how state power, in various forms and by various means, inflicts harm on marginalized populations. The issues addressed by our speakers will include violations of Indigenous peoples' rights, homelessness, mass incarceration, the exploitation of immigrant workers, and the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. In each case, we will confront the vast human toll of state neglect, malfeasance, and oppression, a toll exacted from the most vulnerable among us. And because this think tank is dedicated to the principle of educating for struggle, we will be called on to apply what we learn here to the task of organizing and mobilizing to secure social justice and equality. I personally hope that we will emerge from this event with the knowledge and determination necessary to act effectively and move forward together. Over the next 2 days, we can all inspire and learn from one another. As always, the Institute has brought together a diversity of voices and perspectives, including those of scholars, activists, and artists, students and faculty members, and residents of the greater Cleveland community. We are grateful to all of you for joining us. Thank you very much. And now I'll turn it over to Tim.
Good evening. I am so excited for this year's think tank entitled Education for Struggle, State Violence Then and Now, the Social Justice Institute's fourth biennial think tank since our inception in 2010. I am Tim Black, the acting director of the Social Justice Institute. We're thrilled to offer a program that inspires faculty, students, staff, and Clevelanders to come together for conversation and debate as we work to transcend geographical boundaries and connect across social locations, build and nurture solidarity and community, and struggle together to develop political strategies to transform our social world, especially in these very trying times. The Social Justice Institute could not have created our conference and opened the entire program to the community free of charge without the generous support of our sponsors. We offer our sincere thanks to our colleagues within the CASE community, the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, the President's Advisory Council on Minorities, the Beamer Schneider Professorship in Ethics, the School of Law, the Kelvin Smith Library, and the Office of Multicultural Affairs. We appreciate President Snyder and Dean Taylor's opening comments and their gracious support of the Institute, as well as Provost Basilek's comments who we will hear from tomorrow with welcoming us to the events tomorrow. We thank our community sponsors as well for their vision and dedication to cultivating social justice initiatives in Northeast Ohio. Our gratitude goes to IdeaStreams, Nadeda in Letson, and the Cleveland chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. We are proud to be supported by a number of student groups here on campus and recognize collective action towards social justice, the Black Law Students Association, the Indigenous Alliance, La Alianza, and the Radical Student Union for their commitments to social justice work. I especially want to recognize the hard work and dedication of our planning team. If the members of the planning team are here, would you please stand up? Can we give them a nice... We've been working on this almost since the end of the last think tank, so it's been a long process, and we really appreciate their work. I also want to thank our facilitators, panelists, and breakout session leaders for their contributions over the next few days, and the many volunteers who are helping us this weekend. I want to thank Tony Sias and Nathan Mata from Theater Artists for Social Change, whose collective will be performing tomorrow night. And I especially want to thank our Institute coordinator, Lisa Collins, for all the backstage work that she has done to make this conference possible and to make it run smoothly and to make it appear that I know what I'm doing. Finally, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Rhonda Williams. As most of you know, Dr. Rhonda was the founder of the Social Justice Institute, as Barbara said earlier, but left us this past summer to take a named chair position in history at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Rhonda is with us this evening, was part of the planning committee for this year's think tank, and will be speaking at the final plenary tomorrow at 4 p.m. Dr. Rhonda, please stand up, be recognized. Thank you, Rhonda, for everything. Thank you, Rhonda, for everything you've done to create this very important space here at Case Western. The Social Justice Institute will continue presenting meaningful events, funding innovative research, educating the next generation of leaders, and working toward equal access to opportunity for all people. But we cannot do this important work without you. We hope that you will consider supporting us in these endeavors. Gifts of any size will impact our work and support our signature programs. We can accept contributions of cash or check tonight. You can join the worldwide movement and donate on November 28th, Giving Tuesday, or you can visit our website to give online. We are honored to provide distinctive educational opportunities for students, scholars, and community members, and we welcome you as you become partners in our work. And now to this evening's keynote speaker. This year's keynote speaker was the Planning Committee's first choice. We were delighted when she accepted our offer. She is the exemplar of the scholar activist that we embrace here in the Social Justice Institute. Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz has been active in the international indigenous movement for more than 4 decades. Her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, was honored with the 2015 American Book Award. Her book also received the 2015 Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Excellence in Literature. Dunbar-Ortiz is the author or editor of 7 other books, which includes The Great Sioux Nation in 1977, which was the fundamental document at the first International Conference on Indigenous Peoples of the Americas, held at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. After receiving her PhD in history at the University of California at Los Angeles, she taught in a newly established Native American Studies program at California State University, Hayward, and helped found the departments of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies there. Roxanne grew up in rural Oklahoma, the daughter of a tenant farmer and part Indian mother. She now lives in San Francisco. Her next book is due out in January and is entitled Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. But before I turn over the podium to Roxanne, I want to make a personal comment about an indigenous people's history of the United States. The book had been on my shelf a while, and I had read selected parts of it to draw information for class lectures and talks and that sort of thing. But this past week, I lost my stepfather. He was a skilled craftsman, a plumber, heating and air conditioning expert by trade, and home builder. His great-grandmother was full Cherokee Indian, and he had grown up with a fascination with tribal relics, which he collected across the fields of Illinois. I admired him for his craft, his ability to imagine and to create with his hands, but marveled over the 25 years that I knew him, how he had also taken time to read and develop his social and political consciousness. I remember giving him a copy of Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and talking to him about it as he read it. He was in many ways what I imagined to be the ideal working class man, and he gave me hope for what we could become. While I was away last week to mourn his passing, I took the opportunity to read An Indigenous People's History from cover to cover. Opened up emotionally by the passing of my stepfather, I found the book to be transformative. It took me places intellectually and emotionally I had not gone. It drew historical lines from the Crusades of the Iberian Peninsula to U.S. continental imperialism, think about that for a moment, to U.S. imperialism abroad today, including recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, pointing out, for instance, that today the U.S. military commonly refers to enemy territory as Indian country, or that the Navy SEALs mission that led to the assassination of Osama bin Laden in 2011 was given the code name Geronimo. The book exposed how genocide was a form of career building and hero making, how individualism, competitiveness, and selfishness became righteous character traits, how the intersection of capital expansion and white supremacy left a trail of death, destruction, and unspeakable brutality. Moreover, she showed us how the cultural myths and tropes that we have used to distort and disguise our history have shaped our identities, our culture, our holidays, our misunderstandings of ourselves and our nation, and how our failure to confront our past with deeply reflexive truth and reconciliation practices has left us to reproduce the distortions, violence, and domination that is intrinsic to our history and identities. I came away with the realization that this was a book that should be mandatory reading for every U.S. citizen, that it should be a common reading across all universities and colleges, that it had the potential to change us, to change how we see the very ground we walk on, to challenge our identities, our history, our certainties, our cultural moorings, our humanity. Foremost, I realized that we had selected the perfect keynote speaker to open a weekend of conversation on state violence then and now. When I finished the book, I sat in a dark house lit by a single reading light at 11 p.m. and reflected on my profound experience with the book and by extension with the author. After sitting quietly for nearly an hour, I turned the book over and read the blurb provided by eminent historian Robin Kelly and realized that it encapsulated precisely what I was thinking. He wrote, "This may well be the most important U.S. history book you will read in your lifetime." And with that, it is truly my honor to give you Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz.
He's making me cry. Thanks everyone for being here, and I'm grateful to President Barbara Snyder and Dean Cyrus Taylor for joining us here and for their words of introduction. I want to thank the Social Justice Institute, and especially Interim Director Tim Black, and thank him for his unexpected and maybe feeling undeserved for me praise for the book. It's kind of a dream, you know, that this, for me, that this is of the effect it might have. Doing the research and living through it is the effect it had on me while I was writing it. So I know that there are a lot of people involved in this planning committee, the think tank planning committee, and I so appreciate everything you've done to make this weekend possible and for inviting me to speak. It's a great honor. And I want to also, as everyone else has, honor and acknowledge Dr. Rhonda Williams, the founder of this institute, the Social Justice Institute, and who also was the original organizer of this conference on inviting me. So here we are on Indian land. We're in the Americas, so we're on Indian land. And I want to acknowledge specifically that we are present on the unceded lands of the nations, of many nations, among them the Miami, Shawnee, Wyandot, the Ottawa, Lenape, and the great resistance leaders of this area who should be our main heroes in U.S. history, leaders such as Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and Tecumseh, who with the masses of their people who under the greatest pressures resisted, and in doing so, it assured their survival, their people's survival and continuance. So their history, their resistance forms the authentic history of how Ohio became what it is today, a state, Cleveland, a metropolis, and all on unceded land acquired by genocidal policies and actions of the United States. So Ohio, the Northwest Territory, was the crucible of the founding of the United States on the policy of genocide. This is the vortex. You're in a very important place and have a lot of responsibilities because of it. So the history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism. The objective of settler colonialism, a particular kind of colonialism, is to terminate and replace the presence of indigenous peoples, not as random individuals. This is the very definition of genocide. So what constitutes genocide? The word and the concept of genocide was created by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, published in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. Lemkin was Polish of Jewish descent, a respected lawyer and prosecutor in Poland until the 1939 Nazi invasion. Although Lemkin escaped to Sweden, 49 of his relatives perished in the Holocaust. Lemkin became an advisor to the chief. He moved to the United States. He became an advisor to the chief counsel of the Nuremberg trials, during which his concept of genocide as a crime in international law was one of the legal bases at the Nuremberg trials. Then, for 2 years, with the support of the Truman administration, Lemkin successfully lobbied the states members of the newly established United Nations to adopt the Genocide Convention in the same session in the United Nations that passed the Declaration of Human Rights. So the term genocide is a legal term with a precise definition enshrined in the United Nations International Treaty presented in 1948 and adopted in 1951, titled the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The convention is not retroactive, so it didn't cover, for instance, the Armenian genocide, although it should be recognized as a genocide historically in retrospect, even though the law is not retroactive. So the United States is not responsible under the Genocide Convention before 1988. Why? It took 40 years for the U.S. Senate to ratify it. The only country that had not ratified the convention. As I mentioned, the Truman administration had lobbied for the Genocide Convention. At the United Nations, he had supported Lemkin, who was a dedicated promoter of the convention. And President Truman signed the convention and sent it to the Senate for ratification, which is required by the Constitution. There, the all-white Senate, with the Southerners with the most power, Southern Democratic senators, expressed concern that genocide charges might result from the then existing racial segregation. This is 1951, lynching, all-white juries and police forces, and Ku Klux Klan. They were very insightful that that might be the case, right? In addition, although the treaty was not retroactive, senators expressed fear that it would be used to define the 19th century U.S. treatment of Native Americans as genocide. Again, really insightful. So therefore, don't sign it, don't ratify. As the senators feared, in 1951, the Civil Rights Congress, led by co-founder of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the Opera star Paul Robeson filed a petition in the United Nations titled "We Charge Genocide," in which they stated, "Out of the inhuman black ghettos of American cities, out of the cotton plantations of the South, comes this record of mass slayings on the basis of race, of lives deliberately warped and distorted by the willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease. It is a record that calls aloud for condemnation, for an end to these terrible injustices that constitute a daily and ever-increasing violation of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide." So that's easy to find online. Just Google "We Charge Genocide" and the whole text is there. It should be taught in every school and distributed. Thereafter, when ratification would be proposed in the Senate, which it was from time to time, especially by the Armenian and Jewish lobbies, similar arguments, more nuanced, would be aired, and included the possibility that the actions of the U.S. military in Korea and Vietnam might be cause for genocide charge. You think they don't know these things, they're ignorant, but they read the congressional records. They're very interesting. Native American intellectuals and scholars of the 1950s onward have also discussed the possibilities of international human rights law. And after the U.S. signing of the Genocide Convention in 1988, started work on an actual case. And that work continues. Finally, pressure from the Jewish and Armenian lobbies broke the U.S. holdout under Ronald Reagan, interestingly enough. But by that time, the radical civil rights and Black Power movements had suffered, as the American Indian movement had, and the Young Lords, the Puerto Ricans, La Raza, COINTELPRO, and these movements were, the most radical ones were shattered. On the other hand, many of the reforms that were demanded in affirmative action and, of course, the Civil Rights Act itself, many changes had come about so that even when, so genocide we charge genocide just sort of got lost in the Genocide Convention. And even when a movement for reparations for slavery developed and had some, definitely some legs in the 1990s with Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, the Genocide Convention was not raised. With Native American discussions and publications about genocide, especially since the 1992 Columbian Quincentennial, U.S. historians and other mainstream scholars and intellectuals, including human rights activists, have exerted considerable energy in attempting to redefine the Genocide Convention in ways that conclude that the Genocide Convention in no way applies to the United States, either historically or currently. And a lot of these are very liberal people. Right wing hardly deals with this at all. But the Genocide Convention is clear. It is not a complex document. It's the easiest treaty you will ever read in your life. Its meaning cannot easily be misinterpreted. So I'm going to read it to you, the whole thing. In the convention, or this is a description, in the convention, any one of 5 acts can be considered genocide if committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. As a group, these acts are A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Those last two are actually as if they were written to describe what happened to Native peoples. The following acts are punishable. A, genocide. B, conspiracy to commit genocide. C, direct and public incitement to commit genocide. D, attempt to commit genocide. E, complicity in genocide. That's the entire text of the Genocide Convention. But as the 1951 Civil Rights Congress petition which charged genocide pointed out, it is sometimes incorrectly thought that genocide means the complete and definitive destruction of a race or a people, without thinking, well, there's still Jews, there's still Armenians, that doesn't mean it wasn't genocide. The Genocide Convention, however, defines genocide, and this is also from the We Charge Genocide petition, it defines genocide as any killings on the basis of race, or in its specific words, as killing members of the group. Think police killings. Any intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group is genocide, according to the convention. Also, the convention states causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group is genocide, as well as killing members of the group. So the terms of the Genocide Convention are essential for historical analysis of the effects of European and Euro-American colonialism, particularly settler colonialism, that led to the establishment of the United States, inherently committed to the elimination of the indigenous nations, but also including the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and the situation of descendants of enslaved Africans. I also include, and I'm writing more about this now in my next book, the U.S. military invasion and occupation of Mexico, taking half of it, and the treatment of Mexicans. That is the border, that is an unquiet border. But most importantly, the Genocide Convention is applicable to U.S. policies and actions today and since 1988, and there is no statute of limitations. So even in 2050, if we come up with that case for genocide, it will still be acceptable. So the term genocide is often incorrectly used, as the Genocide Petition noted. But it's also used by U.S. historians and other scholars to describe extreme examples of mass murder in general, the death of vast numbers of people in the midst of aggressive warfare. And of course, this was the case with the Shoah. But, for instance, Cambodia, thereby dismissing claims of U.S. genocide, because how could that, in comparison, there are just not enough people killed. And then some said, well, there are not enough of them to kill, and then some say they didn't kill enough of them, so there's no genocide. But importantly, and no doubt surprisingly to many, the charge of genocide at Cambodia's United Nations Organized War Crimes Tribunal, which I watched streaming from Cambodia. I wasn't in Cambodia, but I watched it. Did not refer to the Khmer Rouge mass killings of hundreds of thousands of Khmers, Cambodians, the ethnic Khmer, who comprise the majority of the population, the largest number of victims. It was not genocide they were charged with. The specific charge of genocide was there. but it related solely to the Khmer Rouge's actions against one indigenous group, the Cham, and to the ethnic Vietnamese population, who were also targeted for elimination because they're not Khmer. Lars Olsen, the tribunal's legal communications officer, explained that is because the definition of genocide in law is, quote, is different from what many people would think genocide is. Simply put, the 1948 Genocide Convention defines genocide as having the intention to eliminate, in part or in full, a group of people based on their race, religion, ethnicity, or nationality, and need not be accompanied by warfare, therefore not in the category of war crimes per se. The Khmer Rouge slaughter of the Khmer population in Cambodia was crime against humanity, for which the individuals responsible were tried, convicted, and sentenced. But they were not tried under the terms of the Genocide Convention, rather for war crimes. So genocide is not a governmental act of mass murder simply worse than anything else, rather a specific kind of act. Our policy. The Genocide Convention is not a war crimes convention. It's a human rights convention, approved, as I said, at the same time as the Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration of Human Rights, which is extremely important, is the basis for all human rights law that exists now, is for individuals. It protects individuals. The right to, for instance, food, clothing, housing. Yeah, read the human rights treaties that the United States has ratified. Whereas the Genocide Convention is the only international law that applies to group rights. That's why it's essential for descendants of enslaved Africans, for Native Americans, for Mexicans, and increasingly for Muslims, as religion is included in this too. Also, clearly the Shoah is the most extreme of all genocides. But the bar set by the Nazis is not the standard required to be considered genocide. The creator of the term, Raphael Lemkin, made that clear because, for one thing, he was as committed to and looking over the pogroms since the Crusades, ever since Christianity was established officially in Europe, the persecution of Jews and Muslims, that this was predictable in leading up to what happened in the Holocaust. So the point of it being a prevention of genocide convention is to look at those kinds of policies that might be in place or actions that might be in place that would lead to genocide in order to prevent it. So most importantly, though, genocide does not have to be complete to be considered genocide, and not one single person has to die, be murdered, to be considered genocide. U.S. history, as well as inherited indigenous trauma, cannot be understood and dealt with without acknowledging the genocide that the United States committed against Native nations, as well as enslaved Africans, both of whose descendants survive in U.S. claimed boundaries. From the colonial period through the founding of the United States and continuing into the 20th century, this has entailed torture, terror, sexual abuse, and rape, massacres, systematic military occupation, removals of indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories, forced removal of Native American children to military-like boarding schools over a period of a century, children stripped of languages and cultures, as well as allotment of land, that is privatization of indigenous territories, and from 1953 to 1974, a legislated policy of Indian termination. The Congressional Act was named the Indian Termination Act, during which sterilization of young Native women was carried out consciously and as policy by the government's Indian Health Service. Of course, accompanying termination was the policy of the Bureau of Indian Affairs policy of relocation, of enticing younger people, especially in young families, to leave reservations. And Cleveland was one of the designated relocation areas, as you probably know, and they're probably descendants of relocated Native people from other parts of the country, from Alaska also. So within the logic of settler colonialism, genocide was the inherent overall policy of the United States from its founding. But there are also specific documented policies of genocide on the part of U.S. administrations that can be identified in at least 5 distinct historical periods. One, the Revolutionary War period through 1832, right here in the Ohio country. 2, the 1830s, Jacksonian era of forced removals. 3, the 1850s California Gold Rush era in Northern California. 4, the Civil War and post-Civil War era up to 1890, of the so-called Indian Wars west of the Mississippi. And 5, the 1950s termination and relocation period. Additionally, there was genocidal policy and practice that overlapped those time periods. As I've mentioned, the compulsory federal boarding schools from 1870s to the 1960s. The Carlisle boarding school, founded, the first one of the boarding schools, a model for all the others, was founded by U.S. Army officer Richard Henry Pratt in 1879 and became a model for the others established by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Then there were also some contracted out to religious missionaries, churches. You have Presbyterians, the Navajo Nation, you have Catholics among the Sioux, and so the religious orders, the Baptists in Oklahoma. So Pratt said, you may have heard this before, in 1892, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the men. Cases of genocide carried out as policy may be found in historical documents as well as in the oral histories of indigenous communities. An example from 1873 is pretty typical, with General William T. Sherman, hero of the Civil War, writing, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. During an assault, the soldiers cannot pause to distinguish between male and female, or even discriminate as to age." The nearly 3 centuries Indian Wars technically ended around 1880. Although the Wounded Knee Massacre of 300 starving Lakota refugees occurred a decade later. Clearly an act of genocidal intent, Wounded Knee is still officially listed as a battle in the annals of U.S. military genealogy. Congressional Medals of Honor were bestowed on 20 of the soldiers involved and have never been rescinded. A monument was built at Fort Riley, Kansas, to honor the soldiers killed by friendly fire. as the refugees had no firearms. A battle streamer was created to honor the Wounded Knee battle and added to other streamers that are displayed today at the Pentagon, West Point, and Army bases throughout the world. This is living history, evidence of genocidal intent. Right here in the Old Northwest Territory is a site of genocide. Colonial settlers and armed white citizens' militias had a 2-centuries-old practice. Those citizens' militias, by the way, are what was mandated in the Second Amendment. A book will be out in January that was mentioned on this. And the other thing that was mandated were slave patrols in the Second Amendment. So it's not what you think it is. When Anglo-American settlers went for independence, these crimes intensified and accelerated practices of invasion and conquest in the Ohio country. It was called the Northwest Territory then. That's a sort of inherent manifest destiny as your first thought is Washington, state of Washington, of Oregon. No, it's Ohio. It was the Northwest of these 13 little colonies that became independent. I call that a kind of inherent manifest destiny that we think Northwest immediately. So it always has to be explained. You know, we're talking about 1783, the Northwest Ordinance. No, it's not the state of Washington. So the Northwest Territory is, as they called it in the Revolutionary War, comprised the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. From 1787 to 1832, the Northwest Ordinance promulgated by the Continental Congress in 1787 drew up plans and military strategies for seizing this vast region of indigenous peoples of a dozen nations who lived in their ancient villages surrounded by their self-subsistent crops. During the previous 2 decades, George Washington, leading the Virginia colonies militia, had encroached in this territory over the Appalachians, mapping the land and selling plots of the land, unceded, to landless or land-poor white farmers who illegally settled there, and formed militias to kill Indians and burn their crops and burn their villages. Although this is the Daniel Boone is the archetype of, of these settlers. Although Britain claimed the territory, it barred settlement west of the 13 colonies. It was illegal for the colonists to go there by British law. The drive of the colonial settlers to expand over the mountain range to appropriate this territory was the primary motivation for the drive for independence from Britain. The genocidal campaigns carried out by the new U.S. Army were resisted by a confederation of indigenous nations. But by 1803, ethnically cleansed Ohio became a state, followed by Indiana 13 years later. In the next period of the U.S., the Army under Andrew Jackson carried out genocidal wars in the South against the Muskogee Creeks and Cherokees, and into Spanish Florida, where U.S. Marines and Army mounted 3 major wars against the Seminole Nation between 1816 and 1858. And the Seminole Nation, this resistant community that grew and grew, and remnants from all of the different confederations went there to fight the United States, was also a marooning place for those who escaped from slavery, joining those communities. So then so these were three major wars against the Seminole Nation between 1816 and 1858. And when Jackson was president in the 1830s, he ordered and the Army carried out forced removal of all the native nations from east of the Mississippi. The Cherokees being the last to go and having to be really brutally forced. 1/3 of their people died on that journey. And during the Civil War, the Union Army forced the removal and 4-year incarceration of the Navajo people under Kit Carson. The mercenary was given, the Army gave him the right to do that. This resulted in the death of half their population. During the same time, the Dakota Nation was forced by the Union Army out of their homeland in Minnesota. After the Civil War, 6 of the 7 divisions of the U.S. Army were stationed west of the Mississippi, where they carried out genocidal wars against the Plains and southwestern indigenous nations, including the intentional extermination of tens of millions of bison. These troops that were pulled out were supposed to be occupying the defeated former Confederate states to allow for reconstruction, for land distribution to former slaves, and democratic elections for their political participation. The military pulling out of the South is what allowed the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations to prevent Reconstruction, impose a reign of terror and restoration of the ex-Confederate elite. But when we talk about the Wild West and all the movies about it, cowboys and Indians west of the Mississippi, it actually originated on the Atlantic shore, and certainly east of the Mississippi. And I think east of the Mississippi here, I always find it difficult to, there's a lot of sympathy, but people don't feel like that they have responsibility because they don't have a lot of Native people in their midst, as in New Mexico or California, or the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest. But here we are in what the U.S. Founding Fathers called the Northwest. The crucible of the founding of the United States is a world power based on land theft, genocide, and slavery, the pillars of capitalism. It is essential to understand that the United States' aggressive white nationalism and settler colonialism form the bedrock of U.S. institutions and historical and continuing white nationalism. A culture of violence, a gun culture, a militaristic culture, and that genocidal policy toward indigenous nations and descendants of enslaved Africans always looms inside the U.S. and has been extended globally by genocidal U.S. policies and wars in the Pacific and the Caribbean, including Central America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and increasingly in Africa. So although you might be convinced, maybe I've convinced you or you're already convinced of U.S. actions and policies historically and today that would even constitute genocide, but why the Genocide Convention matters. It's just a piece of paper, right? Or why international human rights law matters at all. Native nations are still here and still vulnerable to U.S. indigenous policy, as are descendants of enslaved Africans and Mexicans. This isn't just history that predates 1988, when the U.S. ratified the 1948 Genocide Convention, but the history is important and needs to be widely aired and discussed, needs to be in public school texts, and particularly in law schools, in order to comprehend the present. And international human rights law is the only instrument available to oppressed peoples. It's the only existing instrument available to oppressed peoples, at least in the United States especially. The shadow of genocide lies in the fact that the genocidal doctrine of discovery is still a fundamental law of the land in the United States, the legal framework that informs the U.S. colonial system of controlling indigenous nations. And as we know, the U.S. is a nation of laws, and that's the law. But the international human rights treaties the U.S. has ratified are also U.S. law. It is a troubling reality that most citizens of the United States have never heard of the doctrine of discovery. How many of you have heard of it? Well, that's more than, more than the average out there, but you all are, I know I'm preaching to the choir. But there's a good essay in this month's Harper's about that by Rebecca Solnit that we need to preach to the choir. We need to get this down. So it is a troubling reality, although we honor it annually on Columbus Day, which became a federal holiday only in 1937. The same year as the Buffalo Indian head nickel was introduced, apparently as kind of war trophies to make America great again during the dark days of the Depression. Who knows? Indigenous peoples of the whole hemisphere view the celebration of Columbus as a continuing threat of genocide, as Columbus signals the beginning of Christian European overseas colonialism, extending the centuries of crusades against Muslims. Columbus signals the onset of genocide and privatization and monetization of land, water, resources, the triumph of greed, the destruction of the remarkable civilizations of the Western Hemisphere. Thanks to the successful indigenous peoples campaigns nationally and internationally since 1970s, none of the states of the Western Hemisphere continue to celebrate Columbus in 1492 officially, except one, the United States. This is a celebration of genocidal doctrine of discovery. So what is the doctrine of discovery? From the mid-15th century to the mid-20th century, most of the non-European world was colonized under the doctrine of discovery. One of the first principles of international law that Christian Europe monarchies promulgated to legitimize investigating, mapping, and claiming lands belonging to non-Christian peoples outside of Europe. It originated in a papal bull issued in 1455 that permitted the Portuguese monarchy to seize West Africa and enslave all the inhabitants, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade right there. Following the Genovese merchant Columbus landing in the Caribbean, the enterprise, funded and sponsored by the king and queen of the infant Spanish state, another papal bull extended similar permission to Spain to claim the land of the Western Hemisphere and enslave all the people there. Disputes between the Portuguese and Spanish monarchies led to the papal-initiated Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the planet equally between Spain and Portugal. They wouldn't fight with each other. So the Protestant monarchies, of course, came along pretty quickly, and they challenged the Iberian papal domination, and they moved in on what they had staked out, and staked out their own claims, but maintained the doctrine of discovery as their legalistic justification for doing so. So using papal law, even though they were Protestant monarchs. But also, of course, republics. The French Revolution didn't change anything. The French republics used this legalistic instrument for their 19th and 20th century settler colonialist projects. and even made Haiti, which had successfully become an independent state from France, pay to this day, pay for damages for their losses, for French losses. And of course, the United States, when it continued colonization. So in 1792, not long after U.S. independence, then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson claimed that the Doctrine of Discovery, developed by the European states, was international law applicable to the new U.S. government as well. So they saw themselves as a European state. The United States did. Then in the 1820s, the Doctrine of Discovery was codified by the U.S. Supreme Court under John Marshall in decisions regarding the Cherokee Nation. So under this doctrine, the indigenous peoples, even where indigenous peoples continued to live on the land, like reservations, or in, say, New Mexico, in the Pueblos, the actual ownership was the United States. So this decision concluded that Native people were domestic dependent nations, which means captive colonies. This is the law that controls Native nations today and makes them vulnerable to genocide. So the Doctrine of Discovery is so taken for granted that it is rarely mentioned in historical or legal texts published in the Americas. And yet the United States has used the doctrine to rationalize its dominion of its indigenous peoples throughout its history, citing the Marshall Court precedent as recently as 2005 in the U.S. Supreme Court case of City of Sherrill versus Oneida Nation of Indians in denying the Oneida Nation land claim. Although this was the Republican-dominated Scalia Alito Thomas Court, the Oneida case was decided unanimously, very unusual for this court, with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg writing the decision. Few in the United States, except for indigenous people, are aware of this history and continued threat of genocide against indigenous peoples in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments, very thought-provoking, poignant comments. Maybe one of the things that I was really fascinated with when I read the book was, and we talked about this actually earlier today, was those moments in which there was sort of multi-ethnic, multiracial resistance, particularly in the maroon areas that you talked about, or we talked about earlier with the escaped slaves, and the relationships that were developed between Native Americans and the escaped slaves during that period of time. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and a little bit about those relationships as they carried forward through history.
Yeah, it's something that has really interested me because I only learned it by meeting people who came from those situations, and then I would research, but it hasn't been really well researched. There's sort of the Seminole Nation is characterized as one of the 5 civilized tribes, that were relocated to Oklahoma. But there was no, the Seminoles are a Muskogee. The Muskogee language was, the Muskogee people were the predominant people in the South, and then upper a little bit the Cherokees, who were Iroquoian speaking people. So the Muskogee people were Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, but Seminoles formed after the United States, after colonialism was already pressuring, and they moved into, to be away from the United States. They moved into into the Everglades, and also to fight, to protect themselves, to continue resistance. As when Tecumseh, for instance, was killed, and his brother was killed here, and half the resistors were killed. They became refugees, and they went to join the Seminoles. So the Seminoles were many different, from many different tribes, from Cherokee, they all spoke Muskogee was their common language, and they. It was a maroon area because from South Carolina and Virginia, the people who could escape slavery would be able to make their way down the coast to join the Seminoles and be protected. So Jackson, of course, invaded, and in the first Seminole War, the war against the Seminoles, invaded and just simply annexed. It was Spanish territory, just annexed it, just took it and said, now it belongs to the United States. And they didn't have really much of a presence there. You know, the Spanish, they didn't have settlements there, and just a few. So it was then U.S. territory, supposedly. But it was always, I think, for the United States, they admitted, to Osceola, the Second Seminole War, the leader in the Second Seminole War, if you will hand over all of the Africans among you, you can have the Everglades. It's yours. Who wants it? Who wants a swamp? We'll acknowledge it's yours. And he said, how can we do that? They're our flesh. We're all the same people. We're all Seminoles. We're all together. So they refused. And of course, he was killed. And then the Third Seminole War, they tried again. They never won against these resistors. They put the Marines, the Army, white citizen militias, every mercenary, deadly killer, and they were never able to defeat the Seminoles. And who knows these stories? These are, these are stories, we tell stories about the Zapatistas in Chiapas, and we don't even know our own stories of resistance. That these things happen right here is not, we've got to tell these stories and own them. And not only that, there were white landless farmers who also joined the resistance. Osceola was part white. Georgia, right on the border, these really poor whites who were pushed out by slavery. They had the aspiration to own slaves, but they saw this resistance and they were won over to it. So that's the longest term kind of multinational resistance that I think we have to look to. Then there was one in Oklahoma, where I'm from, the Green Corn Rebellion in 1917, against conscription in World War I. There was a lot of socialist influence in Oklahoma. This was before the Bolshevik Revolution. So they were socialists, the Socialist Party. They opposed the war in Europe, thought it was an imperialist war, a rich man's war, poor man's fight, it was their slogan. And they influenced these illiterate sharecroppers and tenant farmers in what was Indian Territory allotted. They were sharecroppers to white farmers, and they were black tenant farmers, black tenant farmers, white tenant farmers, and native tenant farmers, mainly Seminole. And they came together and had this rebellion against conscription. It was very practical in the sense that if my dad was a tenant farmer, so I know that all the children have to work, or someone doesn't eat, and especially the boys of working age. So if they come and take all these boys away from their families, the family will starve. So it was not just ideas, it was material reality. They were fighting for their lives. And they had the plan, their manifesto was they're going to march through the South and get the Brotherhood of Railroad Workers, the Pullman, all the unions, because there were lots of industrial unions there, march to Washington and overthrow the government and establish a socialist commonwealth. So that you've never heard of, I bet.
Okay, yes, exactly. Let's open it up. Would you like to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Roxanne. I'm Beth Castle, and I've been working with some of the Standing Rock legal defense issues going on. One of the things, I just, to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the Lincoln Treaty trial and the connections. But the question, or what I'd like to get your thoughts about, is what's available now that potentially was not, of course, available in 1974 after Wounded Knee, that they could strategically use in the legal strategy right now, because just in case, there's about 400 cases, there's been about 800 of the defendants going on trial. The media disappeared. There's 2 cases they're trying to make that's sort of very similar to the treaty trial, and I sent them your book because they were like, well, what treaty trial? And so that concerned me. But just in terms of the application of UNDRIP or using the Genocide Convention and understanding that the actual the courts where this will be tried is going to be very difficult. The racism is very severe, but how to sort of build a campaign and make those connections, because it's hard to do the scholar activism in real time. I just wondered if you had some thoughts about that, and I'm sorry to make this so long.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, all these trials are going on, and it really needs to be. We had the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee back after the Wounded Knee uprising in 1973. There also were, hundreds and hundreds of, not just the leadership trials were over, but all these hundreds of, so we had a strategy for, it was a period of politicizing the court, the Chicago 8 and that has waned so much. It's very hard to get lawyers to introduce. My mentor in human rights, Justice Frank Newman of the California Supreme Court, well, I met him when he was dean of Bolt Law School. He's been doing that. He's been trying, and when he was justice, I went to a lot of his court cases and saw how he did it in these farm worker cases, that he would bring in human rights, but basically most justices aren't going to do that. The lawyer has to bring it up for the justice to consider it, And of course, Reagan and all of those great chief justices, those justices in California were kicked out, Rosebird and all of them, when Duke Majan came in, and friend of Ronald Reagan was president. So it, I'm not sure how. I know the lawyers in the National Lawyer Guild who are working on it, and I can't convince them, that my own friends who heard all this, it's not real to them. How do they incorporate? I would think, that there are some Native lawyers that would be trying to do that, but I don't know the case for sure. But thanks for the question. I think that's important.
Thank you for your book. I've done the same thing, looked at it piecemeal, and I have to read it cover to cover. But Dr. Black is right that it's transformative, and I would recommend people in the audience to take a look. Cleveland is important. One of your panelists tomorrow, Terry Gilbert, went out in the late 70s and represented some of the Indians with William Kunstler, and then came back, and that's where I got to know Terry. He's on your panel tomorrow. So that legal work was done. But what I want to ask you about, did you attend the Black Hills Survival Gathering in 1980, or you know about it?
No, I wasn't there, but I know about it.
Yeah, well, I wanted to bring that to your attention because this is the program, and I'll present you with the program. This is, to me, a rare archival material, but there's the resistance page, and you spoke of resistance, so I want to recognize some of the people that passed and maybe have your comment on them. The American Indian movement, for those people who don't know, it was probably comparable to the Black Panthers in terms of local resistance, and they paid a terrible price. But at the Black Hills Survival Gathering, I got to meet Russell Means, who was from Cleveland and stayed here for some time and did organizing, but also Dennis Banks and John Trudell and Vernon Bellacourt, and the Bellacourts were down there, and we've lost those people in recent years. And of course, they were already speaking of freeing Leonard Peltier. So if you could recognize some of those resistant leaders and AIM and tell me anything that you have that we should know about them, because, and Chief Fool's Crow was still alive in the 1980s, and he was the inspiration to all these younger Indians. So if any of those people inspire you to say something, please say it.
Thank you. Yes, I had the great honor of knowing all of them. I was in the American Indian Movement in the San Francisco Council, and during the early 70s, and we had, Standing Rock when it was happening this time. I think people didn't know what a revolutionary spirit is always at Standing Rock. This is where the Sitting Bull is buried. This is where the American Indian Movement founded the International Indian Treaty Council. So it's a very important place, and these leaders, of course, were extremely important. Dennis Banks and Vernon Bellacourt, both Anishinaabe from Minnesota, were Clyde Bellacourt and Dennis were in prison together in Sandstone Prison, and started making demands to be able to grow their hair long, to have sweat baths and all, and came out and organized AIM as a kind of self-defense group, like the Black Panthers, only in Minneapolis, where the housing, the public housing, which now houses mainly Somali refugees, was mainly Native Americans at that time. And the same things as any public housing go on. They're dilapidated, they're not taken care of, there's a lot of drugs and crime. But then with the crisis at Pine Ridge over the chairman, they asked the American Indian Movement to come there. Russell Means had already joined. Russell Means actually was here in Cleveland and was the first American Indian Center director here in Cleveland back in the 60s for the people coming on relocation here. So Russell Means and his whole family, the whole extended family, his brothers, Madonna Thunderhawk, his sister, and yes, Dennis Banks passed away recently, John Trudell very recently, Russell Means, Vernon Bellacourt died in his beloved work in Venezuela. He got to die in Caracas, which I thought was really what he would have liked, because he was so dedicated to supporting the revolution in Venezuela. And Clyde is still with us. Madonna is very, she was a leader at Standing Rock in the last fall. So I think, and of course, Carter Camp from Oklahoma, Ponca, was very important in the American Indian movement. He passed away recently. So thank you for that. Yes, we should all honor them. And Leonard Peltier, looks like he's never going to, he's going to die in prison. And he has never wavered from his dedication and commitment. So I think we have a lot of heroes to honor. But I think also we have to know, and it was really evident at Standing Rock, the importance of Native women. And Beth, who just asked the question, is doing that work at Standing Rock, works very closely with Madonna Thunderhawk for many, many years, and with that family. She's publishing a book and making a film on, well, warrior women, but also her dissertation and her book will be, if I get it right, I always hit the punchline. Men are the jawbone, women are the backbone of the American Indian movement. So we have to remember that too, and remember all of the amazing Ella Moose Camp and all of the amazing Native women who've also passed away, the leaders that don't get quite as much attention.
Good evening, everyone. I did want to mention, in case some of you all weren't here last night.
Can you talk
Oh, I'm
into
sorry.
the
I was going to say, I wanted to mention to some of you all, if you weren't here last night, that they did show Wounded Knee. So those of you who missed it, a lot of that was explained. So that would be beautiful for you to see. Ms. Dunbar, thank you so much for being here. I wondered if you could speak to two things. One, because a lot of times we don't have the correct information. And I keep telling people you have to go back further and further and further and further than what someone taught you. One is, there are a lot of people of African-American descent or what have you that may say they're natives. And there's a big argument between a lot of people saying, no, black people aren't natives. And I'm thinking just from you mentioning people coming together, when people come together, babies get made. So I'm thinking that maybe you have just dispelled that. The other thing I wanted to say was, as they say, don't forget your history. Don't forget your past, because it can repeat. And I think we have a big problem with that around the globe, because what's happening here today, to me, seems to be the same thing that was happening a long time ago and continues around the world. When I think about chemtrails, forced vaccines, the food being injected, fluoride in your toothpaste, mercury in your mouth, injected food, the food supply, the GMOs and all that, we're still being attacked. We're still being,
right,
eliminated. Things are happening to people. So if you could speak to those two things. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and these are, just like the We Charge Genocide petition claimed in, back in 1951, that these conditions that existed then that they were referring to, most of them still exist today, and many more new ones, more that pollution from industrialization and, the mad dash for toxic chemicals, which we all wear, and we're all going to have to be drinking bottled water at some point. Where they're going to get it, I don't know, if everything is toxic. So, and these hit, this, we know that there's this it is a kind of a genocide when a whole city like Flint it just happens to be a black city. Now that is coming out in Oakland, California, also a predominantly black city, that there's lead in the water in all the public schools in Oakland. They've recently been tested. And so this is widespread, and I really like people like you all to get interested in international human rights and get involved in the non-governmental processes of human rights in the United Nations. For instance, there's a 2-week meeting every May at headquarters in New York of indigenous peoples, Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. About 10,000 indigenous peoples come to that meeting, representatives. They represent millions, tens of millions of people. It's like an indigenous parliament takes place 2 weeks every year. And people don't even know about it. There's the Africans in the diaspora, meaning descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas, from all over the Western Hemisphere, who meet twice a year at UN headquarters in Geneva, and are working up petitions of genocide, especially of transatlantic slave trade. These things are going on, and we're so prejudiced against the UN. I mean, we actually accept the ruling class interpretation of the UN just being a place where people talk, or it's only the Security Council. The Security Council has nothing to do with what the human rights, or even the Genocide Convention. It's a General Assembly that would deal with that. And that's all of the countries of the world. And the NGOs have an enormous role, in doing this. And people really who are engaged in social justice here just have to extend that and not be provincial, to extend that into introducing international human rights law, including the Genocide Convention, into all of your work. There's a UN treaty on the rights of migrant workers, and I have never been able to get a single solitary migrant workers organization in the United States to go to those treaty hearings or to bring cases against the United States. That's how much prejudice there is in this country. The European migrant workers are there always, very involved, or the Moroccans and the Algerians and all the workers in Europe. So, we have to, the U.S. is an empire, and we act like we're a little country isolated from everyone else in the world, while the empire's doing its work, and destroying the world. So all of our responsibilities extend to bringing international law to the United States and deepening it into the culture. And yes, into our culture, because it's not there yet. Forget about Trump's people, it's not with us. It's not there, and only the Native people have really pursued this and led the way and set an example of what can be done. And with the Durban Conference and the Clintons' White House, what's it called, Beth? White House on Race that John Hope Franklin headed, led to the Durban meeting in Durban, South Africa, on the Conference on Racism. That ended the day before 9/11, so it just got lost, all of that organizing. But, okay, that's my little sermon about it. Thank you.
Some years ago, Justice Brandeis made the statement that you could have democracy or an extreme disparity of wealth and income, but not both. Well, since his day, the disparity of income has grown dramatically. Do you think that we can solve the problems in America between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which are both parties to the racism and sexism and militarism that grip this country? Or do you think we should start opening up to a third party, a people's party?
Well, that's the problem with the U.S. Constitution and how it was set up. It's not a parliamentary democracy. Like every other democracy in the world is a parliamentary democracy. And you can have many different parties, and you can have, they coalesce to make majorities and negotiate with each other. So we have to get rid of, we have to introduce a parliamentary system before we can any third party can have any effect whatsoever. I know there have been valiant efforts. I worked with the Rainbow Coalition, Jesse Jackson's campaign, in both of '84 and '88. And it was a valiant attempt to, and then Bernie Sanders, to take over the Democratic Party. I encourage anyone who wants to work on that to do it. Because I think, yeah, I do think you could develop in a way, the Democratic Party has changed completely. You know, it was completely run by the, what Jesse Jackson used to call the boll weevils, Democrats, the Southern senators, the Democrats, and so it's not impossible, but it would take, it takes organizing, it takes a great effort, and a clear sense of I really think Bernie went a long ways in, and then they met these parties are private organizations, they're not public. They can do anything they want. They're corporations. They're, they can, they're not for the public. So I don't know how, it's like saying take over a corporation, without nationalizing it. We need to nationalize these political parties. But we have to have a mass movement before we can even think about any of these things being possible. There'll be a lot of possibilities if we form a mass movement and say, we are going to change this country. This is what my friend was, this wonderful Dakota woman. She says she wants to deconstruct the entire United States. And you can imagine it. You can imagine if Native nations have independence in this country. Think of the Navajo Nation. We can start deconstructing it and recreating a whole different, if we use our imaginations, instead of being stuck in, kind of dualities and binaries and limited possibilities. We thought big in the 60s, and that's why we got so much done, but we were very limited in what we understood about the world and about the United States especially. We thought we knew the worst. We didn't. We didn't know. We didn't have at that time, a powerful Native input where Native people themselves know now what they didn't know then. We know so much more now. We have so much more potential, but we have to dream big like the 60s, and imagine different worlds than we have now and different possibilities. Maybe that, the Southwest where I live, where it's becoming majority Mexican, maybe they would like to attach themselves to Mexico. Why not? I live there, I would love that. I'd love to be a Mexican citizen instead of a US citizen. So, use your imagination and think of ways of doing things that aren't the usual, entrapments. But, I didn't answer that question about Black Indians. Because I think that's an important question. And I am sorry I got off on my preaching thing about international human rights. But Jack Forbes, another one of my mentors that I dedicate my book to, Vine Delore, Jack Forbes, and Howard Adams, three Native scholars who are very important. But Jack Forbes, who passed away recently, he started researching, he's Lenape from the East Coast, so he's very interested in the genealogies of the East Coast. And he estimates that there's probably not a single descendant of enslaved Africans in the United States who is not part Indian. That the whole, the idea that so many Native people died off, they intermarried, they disappeared. In other words, white Indians are recognized, intermarriage with whites. But because of anti-black racism, there's then you're black, one drop, you're black, right? So I think that Jack Forbes really, in his scholarship, you can go read it and see it. The other is William Katz, his book Black Indians. It's written in the 1960s, and he continues to do work on that. But I think that's extremely important to understand not just that there's the genetics, the genes, but the cultural exchanges that went on that have been separated from, with segregation and with the ethnic cleansing of the East of Indians, so they're not present, and with segregation, and so I thank you for that question. Thank you. Sorry, I forgot that. Thanks.
Roxanne is going to be available for book signing afterwards, so we're going to have to probably take just a couple more questions.
First of all, please forgive me if I'm the victim of a poor understanding of international law here, but you've said that using the Genocide Convention of the UN is the most powerful tool that the struggles for liberation of oppressed nations have. But the US has a somewhat sordid history of ignoring the tenets of international law, even that it's ratified and supposedly recognizes. For example, I know the US military doesn't allow any of its members to be extradited or tried in an international court. So if a genocide convention case could be successfully brought against the US, what power do you think would or even could force it to comply with any terms that might be imposed?
Well, see, that's a lack of imagination. You're accepting the all-powerfulness of the United States, that can never change. We have to destroy that power in order for any of these things to happen. But I also said international human rights law, which includes the Genocide Convention, are the only instruments. These are the only instruments for decolonization. The Declaration on Decolonization of 1960, there were only a few independent, colonies that had become independent at that time. That opened up to a recognition of the legitimacy of all of the armed liberation movements, and they all got seats in the UN, the African National Congress, the Southwest Peoples Organization of Africa, Namibia, the Zimbabwe organization, ZANU and ZAPU, what's the other one? Angola, the Frelimo. So these were all then seated in the UN. They were able to get they used the instruments of the UN. The UN was set up for the purpose of decolonization. And so this was, that didn't mean, those countries did it. They had to do armed struggle to get their independence, even though they had the right to it with the UN being established. So we have to make it happen. It's not going to be given. Nothing. What is it Frederick Douglass said, that they never give you anything, you have to take it? He said it much more beautifully than that. Thank you. Thanks.
Hi. Good evening. Thank you for bringing light to this subject. And while you were speaking, I had a number of things running through my head. But I really wanted to, I appreciated the nuance that you gave to around the understanding of genocide and what it entails. And as you were speaking, what I was thinking about was this idea of control and how that relates to the project of genocide, specifically with I read recently Medical Apartheid, and we talk about organ harvesting and the disappearance of people specifically for this reason, in the way that even with birth control, how we can connect that to control over bodies and things of that nature. And so in this whole subject of genocide and how nuanced it is in the way that it happens in like a non-linear way, how does that connect to the project of white supremacy? And what do you suggest in the essence of, bringing light to this idea of an international human rights law as a tool for kind of, I guess, knocking or pushing away settler colonialism, but how does that connect to white supremacy?
Well, white supremacy, of course, was the origin of colonialism. We have to see the era we're in as really what John Trudell called a 1,000-year Reich. That the U.S. is now head of the Reich, but the first head of the Reich was the Pope. And the Crusades were colonialism. The Crusades were, go to Tunisia, go to Libya, go to Iraq, and see those Christian monasteries everywhere, those buildings everywhere. They were colonizing the Middle East. They're still there. These were wars against the Muslims. That war never ended. From the Crusades through all of this colonialism, we're back there again. So history is, it's not just things that get cut off. Elie Wiesel said this, that the Holocaust was a direct line from the Crusades to Auschwitz. David Stannard, in his American Holocaust, says, it made a stopover in the Western Hemisphere. And that's very important too. But I think that's what I try to do in the book. I have a whole chapter on the Crusades and the importance of the fencing of the commons, the development of capitalism, the Crusades. It was the taking of the land, from being the commons, and then doing that to the whole world. The whole Western Hemisphere was commons. I mean, it wasn't everyone there were boundaries and everything, but it was held in common by different nations. It wasn't private property, bought and sold. So that's a perversion in itself. It's like then commodifying bodies, human bodies, black bodies, African bodies as collateral for getting mortgages in the United States, in the Cotton Kingdom, what built the economy of the United States. So that's all white supremacy. It's all embedded in white supremacy. And I think it's good now we have some of these people are out in the open that trumpet. They've always been there. I come from Oklahoma. I know them. Some of them are my relatives. And they've always been there, but they now have a green light. They have a permission to, but they're not marginal. They almost exist as like to deflect from the inherent white supremacy in every institution in this country. Everything. You dig a little bit and you find white supremacy. And it doesn't even matter if all the faces are brown. The institution remains white supremacist because it hasn't changed. It doesn't matter who's running the store. So yeah, it's absolutely the most important element. And white nationalism is U.S. nationalism. The whole origin story of the United States, the whole content of patriotism is white nationalism. It's embedded in white nationalism. So I think we have to deconstruct that whole patriotic jargon, And then we have to, the other thing is the military, which the There was a shocking poll that came out. I shouldn't have been surprised, but about just a couple of months ago, that the poll was taken to see what people thought of the different institutions of government, the three divisions of government, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. And they all had extremely low, and of course Congress had the lowest, but they all had pretty low, like in 30% confidence. They asked about the U.S. military, 80% confidence in the military as an institution. 80%, that is terrifying. It's terrifying because it's Trump's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So people don't, they don't make that connection though. The military is something seemingly, it's also the only quasi-socialist institution, if you've noticed, that there's actually, it's publicly supported. We pay for it, And even when they do privatize some of it, we're still paying for it. We're supporting it. So it is maybe one reason people like it, if you think about it, if you're socialistically minded, is that they think socialism is a little better, and that's the only place people see it is in the military and some kind of relationships that are different. This buddy thing about, killing people and then being buddies because of it and killing for America. So I think, white supremacy is the major factor.
I'm sorry, but we're going to have to cut it off there. But Roxanne will be available out in the hallway for book signing. If you have a question, maybe you could ask it to her there. So we will be back here at 9 o'clock in the morning. The doors will open at 9 o'clock for breakfast. And then the events will start at 9:30, and we will have, as our keynote speaker tomorrow, Ibram X. Kendi, who will be talking about his book that just won the National Book Award, Stamped from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Race in America.
Great book.
So we look forward to having you back here tomorrow morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Roxanne.
Thank you.